Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't moving forward, it's facing what we left behind. For 62-year-old Inez Corley, 25 years of mountain solitude was supposed to bury the past for good. She built her cabin with her own hands, learned to live without needing anyone, and made peace with the silence. But one October afternoon, while cutting down a dangerous dead tree near her home, her axe splits through the hollow trunk and something falls out. Something that was hidden there on purpose, decades ago. What she finds inside changes everything. It brings back memories she tried to forget and a truth she never wanted to face. What could make a woman who hasn't cried in 25 years finally break down? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at 7,200 feet, tucked into a fold of the Cascade Mountains, where the Douglas firs grew thick, and the nearest neighbor was 9 miles down a logging road that washed out every spring. Inez Corley had built it herself, one timber at a time, in the summer of 2000. She was 37 then, still strong enough to hoist beams and stubborn enough to figure out what she didn't know. The cabin wasn't large, just one main room with a sleeping loft, a wood stove, and windows facing east to catch the morning light. But it was hers, and it was enough. She'd been living here full-time for 25 years now. The world below had changed in ways she could barely imagine. She'd heard about it second-hand, from the occasional hiker who wandered too far off trail, or from the supply runs she made twice a year to Timber Ridge, the small town nestled in the valley. She never stayed long. She'd load her truck with flour, salt, kerosene, and whatever else she couldn't grow or make herself, pay in cash, and drive back up the mountain before anyone could ask too. Many questions. Most folks in Timber Ridge had stopped wondering about her years ago. The older generation remembered when she'd first appeared, a grief-stricken woman who barely spoke and didn't want company. They'd tried in their way to draw her out, invitations to church socials, offers of help with the cabin, friendly waves at the general store. She'd declined them all, politely but firmly, and eventually they'd given up. The younger people didn't know her at all. To them, she was just a name attached to an old story, the woman who lived alone on the mountain and didn't want to be bothered. That suited Inez fine. She'd come here for the silence, and the silence had delivered. Her days followed a rhythm that rarely varied. She woke with the dawn, built up the fire, made coffee from beans she ground by hand. Breakfast was usually oatmeal with whatever she'd foraged the day before, huckleberries in summer, hazelnuts in fall. After breakfast, there was always work to do. Firewood to split, water to haul from the spring, the garden to tend. In winter, she kept the paths clear and maintained her traps. In summer, she foraged and preserved everything she could. Mushrooms, berries, wild greens. She smoked fish from the creek and canned venison when she was lucky enough to get a deer. It was a hard life, but it was honest. Every calorie she consumed, she'd earned. Every comfort she enjoyed, she'd built with her own hands. There was a satisfaction in that, a kind of peace she'd never found in her old life. Her old life, she tried not to think about it too often, but it crept in anyway, usually in the quiet hours before sleep. She'd been a different person then. Inez Corley, botanical illustrator. She'd made a name for herself in that world, small but respected. Her drawings had appeared in field guides and scientific journals. Universities had commissioned her work. She'd loved it, the careful observation required, the patience to render every detail of a leaf or flower with scientific accuracy and artistic grace. She'd been good at it, more than good. But that was a lifetime ago. And the woman who'd held those pens and brushes felt like a stranger now. Inez had packed away her sketchbooks when she'd moved to the mountain, stored them in a wooden chest in the loft where she wouldn't have to look at them. She hadn't drawn anything in 25 years. Her hands were different now, calloused, scarred, capable of splitting kindling, but too rough for the delicate work she'd once done. She told herself she didn't miss it. The people in her old life were gone too, one way or another. Her parents had passed before she'd fled to the mountains. She'd been an only child, and they'd been older when they had her, already in their 40s. They were gone by the time she was 30. No siblings, no cousins she'd kept in touch with. The few friends she'd had, colleagues, mostly had drifted away after Julian died. Julian, even now, 25 years later, his name could stop her cold. Julian Corley, her husband, her partner, the man she'd loved more than she'd thought it possible to love another human being. He'd died in a hiking accident in the spring of 2000, his body lost somewhere in the mountains he'd loved. They'd searched for weeks, but the terrain was unforgiving, and the snowmelt had been heavy that year. The search and rescue teams had finally given up, and Inez had held a memorial service with an empty casket. She'd scattered his ashes, ashes that weren't his, just a symbolic gesture on the mountain. Then she'd built the cabin and disappeared into the wilderness because she couldn't bear to live in a world that no longer had Julian in it. That was the story she'd told herself. Anyway, the story she'd lived by. The truth was more complicated, but she'd buried it so deep she almost believed the simpler version. On this particular October morning, Inez stood in her doorway with a cup of coffee, looking out at the dead Douglas fir that loomed about 30 yards from the cabin. The tree had been dying for years. She'd watched it slowly give up, the needles browning and falling, the bark sloughing off in great sheets. Now it was just a skeleton, 100 feet of bare wood that creaked ominously in the wind. She'd been meaning to take it down for 2 seasons now, but she'd put it off. Partly because it was dangerous work to do alone, and partly because of something she couldn't quite name. The tree had been there when she'd built the cabin. It had still been alive then, though struggling. She'd carved her initials into it that first summer, a small act of claiming this place as her own. But the tree was a hazard now. If it came down in a windstorm, it could easily hit the cabin, and she'd lose everything. She'd survived too much to let a dead tree be her undoing. She drained her coffee and went inside to gather her tools. Axe, saw, rope. She'd drop it away from the cabin if she could, section it where it fell, and spend the next month turning it into firewood. Waste not, want not. The morning was cool and grey, the kind of October day that promised rain by afternoon. Inez worked methodically, clearing the area around the tree's base, checking her escape routes. The tree was massive, 4 feet across at the trunk, maybe more. It would take her all day to bring it down, and several more to process it. She started with the axe, cutting a notch on the side facing away from the cabin. The blade bit into wood that was surprisingly soft, riddled with rot and insect damage. The tree was more fragile than she'd expected. She worked steadily, swinging the axe with the easy rhythm of someone who'd spent decades doing physical labor. Chips of dead wood flew with each strike. 2 hours in, she'd cut deep enough to switch to the saw. She positioned herself on the opposite side of the tree and began the back cut, working slowly and carefully. The saw's teeth rasped through the wood, and she could hear the tree beginning to shift, creaking and groaning as its weight redistributed. She was halfway through the back cut when the saw blade suddenly dropped into empty space. Inez stopped, frowning. She pulled the saw free and peered into the cut. The interior of the tree was hollow, not just damaged, but completely hollow. A cavity large enough to fit a person, hidden beneath a shell of outer wood. She'd seen hollow trees before. It wasn't uncommon in old-growth forest. But something about this felt different. She set down the saw and picked up the axe, using it to widen the opening. That's when she saw it. Wedged into the hollow, about 3 feet off the ground, was a metal box. Inez's heart began to pound. She set down the axe and reached into the cavity, her fingers closing around cold metal. The box was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, made of steel and covered in rust. It was heavy, deliberately placed. She pulled it out and stood. There, holding it, her hands beginning to shake. She knew this box, the initials carved faintly on the lid, barely visible under the rust. I, C, and J. C. Inside, a rough heart. She'd carved those initials herself 30 years ago, when she and Julian had been young and the future had seemed bright and certain. This was their box, the one they'd kept in their apartment in Seattle, filled with mementos and small treasures, love letters, pressed flowers, photographs. She'd thought it was lost, thrown away or donated with everything else after Julian's death. But here it was, hidden inside a tree on the mountain where she'd built her life alone. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Julian had died before she'd moved here. This cabin hadn't existed when he was alive. So how had the box gotten here? Who had put it inside this tree? The wind picked up, and the dead tree groaned. Inez realized she was standing in a dangerous position. If the tree fell now, she'd be crushed. She stepped away, clutching the box to her chest, and moved back toward the cabin. She'd finish dropping the tree later. Right now, she needed to understand what she was holding. Inside the cabin, she set the box on the table and stared at it. Her hands were still shaking. She made herself sit down, take a breath, steady herself. 25 years. 25 years she'd lived on this mountain, believing Julian was dead, believing she was alone. The box sat there, silent and accusing. Finally, she reached out and tried to open it. The latch was rusted shut. She had to work at it with a knife, prying carefully until it finally gave with a screech of corroded metal. The lid opened. Inside, preserved in the dry cavity of the hollow tree, were pieces of her past. She lifted them out one by one, her vision blurring with tears she hadn't shed in decades. Pressed wildflowers, still holding faint traces of color. Lupine, Indian paintbrush, avalanche lily. She and Julian had collected them on hikes, pressing them between the pages of old books. Each one had a date written in Julian's careful handwriting. June 1995, August 1996, April 1998. Beneath the flowers were letters. She unfolded the first one with trembling fingers and recognized Julian's handwriting immediately. "My dearest Inez," it began, "I'm writing this at dawn, watching you sleep. The light through the window turns your hair to copper, and I'm struck again by how lucky I am. How did I get so fortunate? What did I do to deserve you?" She couldn't read anymore. The words swam in front of her eyes. She set the letter down and reached for another. More letters, a dozen of them at least, all in Julian's hand, all filled with the kind of intimate, unguarded love that people only express when they believe they're writing for an audience of one. There were photographs too. Inez and Julian in their 20s, standing at the trailhead of Mount Rainier. Inez and Julian at their tiny wedding, just the two of them and a judge. Inez in the apartment, bent over her drawing table, lost in her work, while Julian photographed her without her knowing. She'd forgotten these images existed. After Julian's death, she'd packed away every photograph, unable to bear looking at them. She'd assumed they were still in storage somewhere, or lost. But here they were, in a box, in a tree, on a mountain. Her own botanical sketches were there, 2 studies of ferns and mosses, rendered in pen and ink. Julian had saved them. He'd always been her biggest admirer, insisting her work belonged in museums. At the very bottom of the box, beneath everything else, was something that made her stop breathing. A photograph she'd never seen before. Julian, standing in front of a small house, the ocean visible in the background. He was older in this photo, the lines around his eyes deeper, his hair touched with grey. He looked like he'd look if he'd lived into his 50s. But Julian hadn't lived into his 50s. Julian had died at 39, except the date stamp on the back of the photograph read September 2000, 6 months after his death. Inez sat frozen, the photograph in her hands, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. The implications crashed over her like a wave. Julian hadn't died. He'd left. He'd faked his death and disappeared, and she'd spent 25 years grieving a man who'd chosen to abandon her. The box fell from her lap, its contents scattering across the floor. Inez stood up, her chair scraping loudly in the silence of the cabin. She walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging the pain. Everything she'd believed, everything she'd built her life around. A lie. The dead tree still needed to come down, but Inez couldn't bring herself to go back outside. She spent the rest of that day sitting at her table, staring at the contents of the box spread before her like evidence at a crime scene. The photograph haunted her. She kept picking it up, studying every detail. Julian's face, older but unmistakably him. The small house behind him, weathered shingles and a blue door. The slice of ocean in the background, grey and vast, and standing next to him, partially visible at the edge of the frame, was someone else, a woman, younger, dark-haired. Her face was turned away, but her hand rested on Julian's shoulder. Inez had examined that hand for an hour, looking for clues. No ring. The fingers were slender, the nails short. It could have been anyone, but it wasn't anyone. It was someone important enough to be in a photograph with Julian after he was supposed to be dead. The date stamp was irrefutable. September 2000. Inez had been living in this cabin by then, alone, still raw with grief. She'd been chopping wood and hauling water and teaching herself to survive, believing she was honoring Julian's memory by living in the wilderness they'd both loved. And he'd been alive, standing in front of a house by the ocean with another woman. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that Inez couldn't even feel angry yet. She was still in shock, her mind circling the same questions over and over. Why would he fake his death? Who had hidden the box in the tree? How long had he been planning to leave her? She remembered the last few months before his death, before his disappearance. She corrected herself bitterly. He'd been distracted, preoccupied. She'd attributed it to work stress. Julian had been a botanist, working for an environmental consulting firm that assessed land for development projects. It was good work, important work, but it came with pressure, deadlines, difficult clients, political complications. He'd been taking a lot of phone calls those last few months, stepping outside to talk where she couldn't hear. When she'd asked about it, he'd been vague. Just work stuff, he'd said. Nothing to worry about. She'd believed him, why wouldn't she? They'd been married for 12 years. They trusted each other. Or so she'd thought. The hiking accident had been sudden. Julian had told her he was going out for a day hike in the Cascades, somewhere he'd been dozens of times before. He'd kissed her goodbye that morning, she could still remember it, the scratch of his beard, the smell of coffee on his breath, and promised to be home by dinner. He never came home. By midnight, she'd called the rangers. They'd found his truck at the trailhead, his pack missing. The search had gone on for 3 weeks. They'd found tracks leading up toward a ridge, then nothing. The assumption was that he'd fallen, that his body was somewhere in the vast wilderness, hidden by terrain or scavengers or simple bad luck. His parents had flown out from Ohio for the memorial service. They'd been devastated, aged a decade in a week. They'd died themselves within 5 years, his mother from cancer, his father from a heart attack that Inez privately believed was just giving up. If they'd known Julian was alive, would it have saved them? The thought made her stomach turn. She picked up one of the love letters and read it again, looking for clues she'd missed the first time. But it was just what it appeared to be, a letter from a man deeply in love. No hints of deception, no shadows of a planned betrayal. I keep thinking about the cabin. Julian had written in one letter, dated 1997. Our retreat in the mountains. Someday we'll build it, Inez. Just the two of us, far enough from everything that we can hear ourselves think. We'll live simply. Garden, forage, draw and study plants all day. Grow old, together, in the wilderness. I can see it so clearly. She had built that cabin. She had lived that dream. just not with him. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. As darkness fell, Inez finally moved. She gathered the contents of the box carefully, placing everything back inside except for the photograph. That she kept out, propped against the sugar jar where she could see it. She built up the fire and made herself eat something, though she barely tasted it. Her body was going through the motions while her mind spun in circles. She kept coming back to the same question. Who had hidden the box? It couldn't have been Julian. He was supposedly dead or gone before she'd built the cabin, before she'd even bought this land. The tree had been alive when she'd arrived. She'd carved her initials into it that first summer, just her initials, alone. The heart, with both their initials, had been carved years earlier, in a different place, on a different tree. Someone had found their box, brought it here, and hidden it in a tree they knew she'd eventually have to cut down. Someone who knew about this place, who knew she'd be here. The thought was chilling. Inez wasn't used to feeling vulnerable. She'd lived alone for 25 years without fear. She knew these mountains, knew how to handle herself. She'd dealt with bears and cougars and harsh winters. She'd never felt unsafe. But now, sitting in her cabin with a box full of ghosts, she felt exposed in a way she hadn't since she'd first arrived. Someone had been here. Someone had hidden this box, had wanted her to find it. The question was why? And were they still watching? She stood and checked the door, making sure it was barred. She checked the windows, drawing the curtains she rarely bothered to close. Then she climbed to the loft and retrieved something she hadn't touched in years, a revolver wrapped in oilcloth that she'd bought when she'd first moved to the mountain. She'd learned to shoot, practiced enough to feel competent, then put it away and forgot about it. Now she cleaned it, loaded it, and set it on the table next to the box. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her chair by the fire, watching the shadows, listening to every creak and rustle. The wind had picked up, and the dead tree groaned like something alive. By morning, she'd made a decision. She needed answers. She needed to know what had happened to Julian, why he'd left, where he'd gone. She needed to know who had hidden the box, and why. And she needed to know if he was still alive. The photograph suggested he might be. He'd looked to be in his 50s in that image. If it was taken in 2000, he'd be in his mid-60s now. Still alive, possibly. Still out there somewhere. The thought filled her with an emotion she couldn't name. Not quite hope, not quite dread, something in between. She'd spent 25 years learning to live without him, learning to be alone. She'd convinced herself she preferred it this way, that solitude was a choice she'd made rather than a prison she'd built. But if Julian was alive, if he was out there somewhere, then everything she'd told herself was based on a lie, and she couldn't live with that. Not anymore. As the sun rose over the mountains, Inez began to pack. Inez hadn't packed a bag in years. She stood in front of her closet, a simple rod hung between two walls, and realized she didn't own anything suitable for the world below. Everything she had was practical. Work pants, flannel shirts, wool sweaters, sturdy boots. Nothing that would help her blend into a town or a city. Not that it mattered. She wasn't going to blend in regardless. She packed light. A change of clothes, basic toiletries, the box with its contents. She wrapped the photograph carefully in a cloth and tucked it into an inner pocket of her jacket. The revolver went into her pack, along with cash she kept hidden in the cabin, several $1,000s, her emergency fund, untouched for 2 decades. The truck was another concern. She'd bought it used in 1998, and it had been old then. She kept it maintained well enough to make the twice-yearly supply runs, but she had no idea if it would handle a longer journey. The battery might be dead, the tires were probably rotted, but when she turned the key, the engine coughed to life. She let it run while she did a final check of the cabin, making sure the fire was out, the windows secured, the food stores protected from animals. She hesitated at the door, looking back at the space that had been her whole world for 25 years. It looked smaller somehow, more fragile, just a room with a stove and a bed. Not the fortress of solitude she'd imagined it to be. She pulled the door shut and didn't look back. The drive down the mountain took 3 hours. The logging road was worse than she remembered, washed out in places, overgrown in others. She had to stop twice to clear fallen branches. But the truck held together, and by noon she was pulling into Timber Ridge. The town had changed. New buildings had gone up, old ones torn down. There was a coffee shop now, something trendy with a chalkboard menu visible through the window. The general store where she bought her supplies had expanded, adding a section for tourists, T-shirts and postcards, and local honey in decorative jars. Inez parked in the front of the store and sat for a moment, gathering herself. She hadn't been around this many people in months. Through the window, she could see a handful of customers browsing the aisles. The thought of walking in there, of making small talk, of being looked at, made her stomach tighten. But she needed information, and she needed supplies for whatever came next. She went inside. The clerk at the register was young, maybe 25, someone who definitely hadn't been working here on Inez's last visit. She looked up when Inez entered, smiled automatically, then looked again with open curiosity. "Can I help you find anything?" "Just looking," Inez said, her voice rough from disuse. She moved through the store, picking up items she didn't really need. Batteries, a map, protein bars, anything to avoid standing still and being watched. But she was being watched. She could feel it. The other customers glancing at her, the older woman by the canned goods doing a double take, someone who recognized her, probably. Someone who remembered the hermit woman from the mountain. Inez brought her items to the counter and paid in cash. The clerk counted out the bills slowly, clearly wanting to ask questions but not quite daring to. "Do you have a phone I could use?" Inez asked. "Local call." The clerk hesitated, then pushed the store's landline across the counter. "Sure. Go ahead." Inez dialed the number for the county records office, a number she'd memorized years ago for reasons she couldn't remember now. When someone answered, she asked about property records for Crescent Bay, Oregon. "I need to know who owns a specific property," she said. "A small house, probably coastal. I have a photograph, but no address." The voice on the other end was patient but firm. "We'd need an address, or at least a street name. You can come into the office and look through the property maps if you'd like." "Where's the office?" "Crescent Bay, right on Main Street." Inez thanked her, and hung up. The clerk was watching with barely concealed interest. "You heading to Crescent Bay?" the clerk asked. "Maybe. It's about 4 hours from here. Straight west, you'll hit the coast highway, then south. Pretty drive." Inez nodded and gathered her purchases. She was almost to the door when a voice stopped her. Inez Corley." She turned. The older woman from the canned goods aisle was walking toward her, a tentative smile on her face. She was in her 70s, white-haired, wearing a cardigan despite the warmth. "I thought that was you," the woman said. "I'm Harriet Chen. We met years ago, when you first came to town. I brought you a casserole, remember?" Inez had a vague memory of it, a kind woman at her door, a dish of something covered in foil, an awkward exchange where Inez had accepted the food just to make the woman leave. "I remember," Inez said. "How are you? We never see you anymore." "I'm fine. Just passing through today." Harriet's smile faltered a little. "Well, it's good to see you. If you ever need anything, I appreciate it," Inez said, cutting her off as gently as she could. "Thank you." She left before the conversation could continue. In the truck, she sat with her hands on the wheel, breathing slowly. 4 hours to Crescent Bay. 4 hours to whatever answers waited there. She started the engine and pulled onto the highway. The drive west took her through landscapes that shifted from mountain forest to high desert to coastal range. She stopped once for gas, using the restroom at a station and catching sight of herself in the mirror. She looked old, not just older, but old. Her hair was completely grey, pulled back in a braid that hung past her shoulders. Her face was lined and weathered, her hands scarred and rough. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd lived a hard life outdoors. The thought didn't bother her as much as it might have. She'd earned every line, every scar. But standing there in the fluorescent light of a gas station bathroom, she had a sudden flash of Julian's face, young and unlined, the way she'd last seen him. Or thought she'd last seen him. What would he look like now? Would she even recognize him? She drove on. Crescent Bay revealed itself slowly, the highway winding down through hills, until suddenly there was the ocean, vast and grey and endless. The town itself was small, maybe a few thousand people, built along a curved harbour that gave the place its name. Inez found the county records office just as it was closing for the day. She parked and approached the door, but a woman was already locking up. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "We close at 5, but we'll be open tomorrow at 9. "I need to find someone," Inez said. "It's important." The woman paused, key in hand, studying Inez's face. Whatever she saw there made her relent. "Come on," she said, unlocking the door. "But I can only give you 20 minutes. Inside, the office was cramped and musty, filing cabinets lining the walls. The woman, her name tag read Louise Brennan, deputy clerk, led Inez to a large table covered in property maps. "What are you looking for?" Inez pulled out the photograph and laid it on the table. "This house. Somewhere in Crescent Bay, I think. The ocean's in the background." Louise studied the photo, then nodded slowly. "That's the north end of town. See the rocks in the background? That's Devil's Point. There's only about a dozen houses out that way." She pulled out a map and spread it across the table, pointing to a section outlined in blue. "This whole area. If you drive out Shore Road, you'll find it." "Do you keep records of who lives there?" "Property tax records, yes, but those are public only if you know the specific address." Louise looked at Inez carefully. "This is someone you're trying to find?" "Yes." "Someone you lost touch with?" Inez nodded, not trusting her voice. Louise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've worked here 30 years. I know most of the people in this town, at least by name." "Who are you looking for?" "Julian Corley," Inez said, "or he might have used a different name." Louise's expression shifted, something flickering across her face. Recognition, and something else, pity, maybe. "Corley," she said softly. "I knew a Jim Corley. Lived out on Shore Road for about 10 years, maybe 15 years back. Kept to himself mostly. Had a daughter with him." Inez's heart was pounding. A daughter. Teenage girl. Quiet, like him. They left town around 2010, 2011. "I don't know where they went. Do you know what happened to them? Where they might have gone?" Louise shook her head. "I'm sorry. They didn't leave a forwarding address. Jim paid his property taxes in cash every year, always on time. When he left, he just left. Sold the house to a couple from California." Inez stared at the map, at the small square representing a house where Julian had lived, with a daughter. A daughter he'd never mentioned. A daughter who would be, what, 40 now? 45? The pieces weren't fitting together. Nothing made sense. "Can you tell me anything else about them?" Inez asked. Louise thought for a moment. "Jim was kind, polite. The girl was smart, I remember that. She used to come into the library, check out books about plants and biology. She looked like him. Same eyes." "Did you ever ask where they came from? Why they were here?" "You don't ask too many questions in a small town," Louise said gently, "especially when someone clearly wants privacy." "I figured they had their reasons." Inez nodded. She understood that better than most. "The house," she said. "Can I see it?" Louise wrote down the address on a slip of paper and handed it over. "It's the blue one, end of Shore Road, but like I said, someone else owns it now. They might not appreciate a stranger showing up. I'll take my chances." Louise walked her to the door. As Inez was leaving, the older woman touched her arm. "Whatever you're looking for," she said, "I hope you find it, but sometimes the truth isn't what we want it to be." "I know," Inez said. She drove to Shore Road as the sun was setting, the ocean turning gold and pink in the dying light. The houses were scattered, separated by patches of shore pine and salal. The blue house sat at the end of the road, exactly as it appeared in the photograph. Inez parked across the street and sat there, looking at it. The shingles were the same, the blue door was the same, but there were differences: a new deck, a garden that hadn't been there before, curtains in the windows. Someone else's home now. But once Julian had stood here. He'd opened that door. He'd lived a life she knew nothing about, with a daughter she'd never known existed. The weight of it pressed down on her, and for the first time since finding the box, Inez let herself cry. Inez sat in the truck until dark, watching the blue house. Lights came on inside, warm and yellow. Through the windows, she could see movement, someone cooking dinner, the flicker of what might be a television. An ordinary evening in an ordinary house. She couldn't bring herself to knock on the door. What would she say? "Excuse me, my supposedly dead husband used to live here with a daughter I didn't know about. Can I look around?" Instead, she drove back into town and found a motel. The Crescent Bay Inn. A single-story building with peeling paint and a neon sign that buzzed in the darkness. The room was small and smelled of mildew, but it had a bed and a door that locked. Inez lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. Julian had disappeared in April 2000. The photograph was dated September 2000. So within 5 months of his supposed death, he'd been alive and living in Crescent Bay with a teenage daughter, which meant the daughter had existed before he disappeared. Where had she been? Why had Julian never mentioned her? Inez thought back to their marriage, searching for clues she'd missed. Had there been unexplained absences, secret phone calls, money disappearing? There had been the phone calls, those last few months, and Julian had travelled for work sometimes, gone for days at a time to survey land in remote areas. She'd never questioned it. Why would she? But now every memory was suspect. Every business trip could have been a visit to his daughter. Every late night at the office could have been something else entirely. The betrayal went deeper than she'd imagined. By morning, Inez had a plan. She drove back to the county records office when it opened and asked to see property tax records for the blue house on Shore Road. The records showed that James Corley had purchased the property in 1995 and sold it in 2011, paid in cash both times. 1. 3 years before Julian had supposedly died. He'd been living a double life for at least 3 years, maybe longer. Inez felt physically sick. She asked Louise if there were any other records, utility bills, voter registration, anything that might give her more information. Louise helped her search, her expression sympathetic. They found a few things. Jim Corley had registered his daughter for homeschooling in 1998. Her name was Willa. No mother listed on the paperwork. Willa Corley. Inez repeated the name silently. Julian's daughter. A person who existed, who had a name and a history, who had lived in that blue house and checked out books about plants from the library. "Do you have any idea where they might have gone?" Inez asked. Louise shook her head. "I asked around after you left yesterday. Nobody seems to know. They kept to themselves. The few people who remember them said Jim was a good neighbor, helped with things, snow removal in winter, that kind of thing, but he never talked about his past." "What about the daughter? Did she have friends?" "Not that I heard. Boat. She was homeschooled, so she wouldn't have gone to the local school. I'm sorry I can't be more help." Inez thanked her and left. She sat in the truck, holding the slip of paper with Willa's name on it. A daughter. Julian had a daughter. The enormity of it was almost too much to process. It wasn't just that he'd left Inez, it was that he'd had an entire life she knew nothing about, a child, responsibilities, a history that predated their marriage. Unless the thought struck her like a blow. What if Willa had been born during their marriage? What if Julian had been having an affair, had fathered a child with someone else while married to Inez? She did the math. If Willa had been a teenager in 2000, she would have been born in the mid-1982. Inez and Julian had married in 1988. They'd been together since 1985. So Willa could have been born before they met, or just after. Either way, Julian had hidden her existence for their entire relationship. Why? Inez drove aimlessly, through town, past the harbour, where fishing boats rocked in their slips, past the tourist shops and restaurants. She found herself at the library, a small brick building near the water. Inside, she approached the librarian, an older man with reading glasses on a chain. "I'm looking for information about someone who used to live here," Inez said. "Jim Corley and his daughter Willa. They left about 15 years ago." The librarian's face brightened. "Willa? Of course I remember her. Lovely girl, very bright. She must have read every book we had on botany and biology. Do you know where they went?" "I'm afraid not. She came in one day to return her books and said they were moving. She didn't say where. I remember being sorry to see her go. She was one of our best patrons." "Did she ever talk about her mother? Her family?" The librarian frowned, thinking, "Not that I recall. It was just the two of them. Jim homeschooled her. She was very independent for her age." "How old was she when they left?" "Oh, mid-20s, I'd say. She wasn't a child anymore. I got the impression she was taking care of her father as much as he was taking care of her." Mid-20s. So Willa would have been born around 1985 or 1986, before Inez and Julian had met. The thought brought a strange sense of relief. Not an affair, then. A child from before, but still a secret, still a betrayal. Inez thanked the librarian and left. Outside, she stood on the library steps, looking out at the ocean. Julian had lived here. He'd walked these streets, looked at this water. He'd raised a daughter here, in secret, while Inez had grieved him as dead. The box. Someone had hidden the box in the tree on her mountain. If Julian had been alive all these years, had he hidden it? Had he wanted her to find it eventually? Or had it been Willa? The thought chilled her. If Willa knew about Inez, what did she know? What had Julian told her? Inez needed to find Willa. She was the key to everything. She went back to the motel and used the phone in the office to call every Willa Corley she could find in the phone book. There were 3 in Oregon, none in Crescent Bay. She called them all. The first was a woman in her 70s, wrong Willa. The second was a teenager, wrong again. The third number rang and rang, no answer. Inez hung up and tried a different approach. She called the University of Washington, asked for the botany department. If Willa had been interested in plants, maybe she'd gone into the field. The secretary who answered was polite but unhelpful. "We have thousands of students. Unless you have more specific information." She would have been a student around 2005 to 2010, Inez said. "Willa Corley. Interested in botany, ecology, that sort of thing." There was a pause, the sound of typing. "I don't see anyone by that name in our records." Inez tried 3 more universities. Nothing. She was running out of options. Willa could be anywhere. She could have changed her name, moved out of state, dropped off the grid entirely, like her father had. The thought made Inez pause. If Julian had been running from something, and the more she learned, the more certain she was that he had been, then maybe Willa was too. Maybe they'd both disappeared for a reason. She thought about the hollow tree, the hidden box. Someone had wanted her to find it. Someone had placed it there deliberately, knowing she would eventually cut down that tree. But why? What was the point? Unless it was a message. A way of saying, "I'm sorry," or "This is the truth," or "Come find me." Inez looked at the photograph again, studied Julian's face. He looked tired in the image. Older, worn down, not like a man who'd escaped to freedom, but like a man carrying a burden. What had he been running from? And was he still running? She thought about the letters in the box, the pressed flowers, the photographs. Evidence of a love that had been real, at least at one time. Julian had saved those things. He'd kept them, even after he'd left. That had to mean something. By evening, Inez had made a decision. She would hire someone to help her find Willa. A private investigator, someone with resources and connections she didn't have. She found one in the phone book, L. Brennan Investigations. The address was local. When she arrived at the office the next morning, she realized why the name had seemed familiar. Louise Brennan, the deputy clerk from the county records office, opened the door. "I wondered if you'd find your way here," Louise said with a slight smile. "Come in." Louise's office was small, tucked above a bakery on Main Street. The walls were covered with filing cabinets and corkboards, pinned with photographs and documents. A desk sat by the window, overlooking the street and the harbor beyond. "I do this part-time," Louise explained, gesturing for Inez to sit. "The county clerk job pays the bills, but this is what I actually enjoy. Sit down. Tell me what you need." Inez sat in the worn leather chair across from Louise's desk. "I need to find Willa Corley." "Jim's daughter." "Julian's daughter," Inez corrected. "His real name was Julian. Julian Corley. He was my husband." Louise's expression shifted, understanding dawning. "I see. He disappeared 25 years ago. I thought he was dead. I've been living alone on a mountain, believing he died in a hiking accident. Then I found a box hidden in a tree with a photograph proving he was alive months after his supposed death, living here, with a daughter I never knew existed." Louise listened without interrupting, her fingers steepled under her chin. "I need to know what happened," Inez continued. "Why he left, where he went, if he's still alive. And I need to find Willa because she's the only person who might have answers. How did you know to come to Crescent Bay? The photograph. The ocean in the background. I started calling county offices up and down, the coast, until someone recognized the location." Louise nodded slowly. "That takes determination. I've had 25 years of questions. I need answers. Finding people is what I do," Louise said. "But I have to be honest with you, if someone doesn't want to be found, if they've been careful, it can be nearly impossible, especially if they've changed their names. Can you try?" "I can try, but it'll take time, and I'll need everything you know. Names, dates, any connections or associations, physical descriptions, anything." Inez told her everything. About Julian, their life in Seattle, his work as a botanist, his supposed death in 2000, the box, the photograph, the letters, Willa's age, her interest in plants, the fact that she'd been homeschooled. Louise took notes, asking clarifying questions. When Inez finished, Louise sat back in her chair. "I remember the logging scandal," she said quietly. Inez frowned. "What?" "About 25 years ago, there was a botanist who was going to testify against a timber company. They were doing illegal logging in protected areas, falsifying environmental reports. The botanist had evidence, but he died before the trial hiking accident, they said. The case fell apart without him." Inez felt her chest tighten. "Julian, I can't be certain, but the timing matches. And if it was him, if he was about to testify against people with that much money and power—" Louise paused. "That would be a reason to disappear. You think he faked his death to escape them? It's possible. Or they faked it for him, made him disappear. But the photograph, he was alive. In Crescent Bay. Maybe he went into hiding, changed his name, laid low, waited for things to cool down." Inez's mind raced. The box. Someone hid it in a tree on my property. Someone who knew I'd eventually cut that tree down. "Could have been insurance," Louise said. "A way to leave a trail in case something happened to him. Or a message. Telling me the truth." Louise leaned forward. Here's what I'll do. I'll search for any James or Jim Corley who might match your Julian's description. I'll look for Willa Corley, cross-reference with botanical programs, environmental organizations, anything related to plants or conservation. If she followed in her father's footsteps, there might be a trail. How long will it take? Could be days, could be weeks. These things are unpredictable. I'll wait, Inez said. You might want to get a better place to stay than the Crescent Bay Inn. There's a cottage rental week by week, about a mile from here. Clean, quiet. I can give you the number. Inez nodded. She hadn't thought beyond finding Crescent Bay, but Louise was right. She might be here for a while. She rented the cottage that afternoon. It was small but comfortable, perched on a bluff overlooking the ocean. One room with a kitchenette, a wood stove, large windows facing the water. It reminded her of her cabin, but different, softer, less isolated. That night, she stood at the window and watched the waves. The ocean was nothing like the mountains, restless where the forest was still, endless where the trees provided boundaries. But there was something calming about it nonetheless. She thought about Julian standing here, or somewhere nearby, watching this same ocean. Had he thought about her? Had he regretted leaving? Or had he been relieved to escape? The next few days passed slowly. Louise called with updates, small bits of information that added pieces to the puzzle but didn't complete the picture. She'd found records of the logging scandal. Julian had been the lead botanist on an environmental assessment for a timber company called Pacific Northwest Lumber. He discovered they were logging in protected old-growth areas and falsifying their reports. He'd gone to the authorities, agreed to testify. 2 weeks before the trial, he'd disappeared. The company had been investigated, but never charged. Without Julian's testimony, the evidence wasn't enough. Pacific Northwest Lumber is still in business, Louise said. They're huge now. Hundreds of employees, operations in 3 states. Do you think they're still looking for him? After 25 years? Probably not. But back then, they would have had every reason to want him gone. Inez thought about the implications. If Julian had been in danger, if he'd disappeared to protect himself and to protect her, then everything she'd believed about his betrayal shifted. He hadn't left her. He'd left to keep her safe. The thought was almost harder to bear than the betrayal. Louise also found a lead on Willa. A woman named Willa Corley had published a paper on native plant restoration 5 years ago. The paper listed her affiliation as the North Cascades Botanical Research Station in Washington. It might not be her, Louise warned. Corley's not an uncommon name. But it might be. I called the research station. They confirmed a Willa Corley works there, but they wouldn't give me any other information. Privacy concerns. Inez felt a surge of something, hope, maybe, or just desperate need. Where is it? About 3 hours north of Seattle. Remote location near the Canadian border. It's a field station, mostly focused on alpine ecology and climate research. Plants, mountains, it fit. I need to go there, Inez said. You might want to call first. Make sure she'll see you. She'll see me. Louise looked at her for a long moment. What are you going to say to her? I don't know yet. She's his daughter, Inez. If Julian told her anything about why he left, about what happened, she might be protective of him. Defensive. I understand. And if he's still alive, if she knows where he is, she might not tell you. That's a risk I have to take. Louise nodded. All right, I'll give you the address. But Inez, prepare yourself. Whatever you find out, it might not be what you want to hear. I've been preparing for 25 years, Inez said. She left Crescent Bay the next morning. The drive north took her back through landscapes. She recognized the coastal range giving way to the lowlands around Seattle, then the mountains rising again. She stopped in Seattle for gas and supplies, struck by how much the city had changed. More buildings, more traffic, more people. It felt alien. She continued north, following Louise's directions. The research station was indeed remote, accessible only by a narrow forest service road that wound up into the mountains. The landscape here was different from her own mountains, wetter, denser, the trees enormous and ancient. The station itself was modest, a cluster of buildings around a central lab, surrounded by experimental gardens and greenhouses. Inez parked and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. This was it. The woman inside might have answers, might know where Julian was, might know why the box had been hidden, might look at Inez with Julian's eyes. Inez got out of the truck and walked toward the main building. Through the greenhouse glass, she could see someone working, a woman, dark-haired, bent over a planting bed. Inez opened the greenhouse door. The woman looked up, and Inez knew immediately. The shape of her face, the set of her jaw, the direct gaze. Julian's daughter. "Can I help you?" Willa asked. "My name is Inez Corley," Inez said. "I need to talk to you about your father." Willa's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Recognition, and something else, wariness maybe, or resignation. "I wondered when you'd come," she said quietly. She set down her trowel and stood, brushing soil from her hands. She was tall, lean, probably in her early 40s. She wore work clothes, canvas pants, a flannel shirt, boots. Her hair was pulled back in a practical braid. She looked like someone who spent her life outdoors, like someone who understood plants and soil and the slow patience of growing things. Like her father. "How did you find me?" Willa asked. "A private investigator." "It wasn't easy." Willa nodded slowly. "Come inside. We should talk somewhere private." She led Inez out of the greenhouse and across the compound to a small cabin set back from the main buildings. Inside was simple, a desk covered in papers and plant specimens, bookshelves overflowing, a wood stove, a narrow bed, a place for working and sleeping. Nothing more. Willa gestured to a chair and sat across from Inez at the small table. "He told me about you," Willa said. "Every day of my life he told me about you." Inez felt her throat tighten. "What did he tell you?" "That you were the love of his life. That you were brilliant and kind and stubborn. That you could draw plants so perfectly they looked more real than photographs. That leaving you was the hardest thing he ever did." "Why did he leave?" Willa was quiet for a moment, studying Inez's face. "How much do you know?" "I know about the timber company. The testimony. His disappearance. I know he came to Crescent Bay and lived there with you. I know someone hid a box in a tree on my property with a photograph showing he was alive." "That was me," Willa said. "I hid the box." Inez stared at her. "Why?" "Because he asked me to. Years ago, before he got sick, he said if anything happened to him, if he didn't make it, I should make sure you knew the truth." "What truth?" "That he never stopped loving you, that he left to protect you, that every day for 25 years he's carried you with him." Inez's hands were shaking. "Is he alive?" Willa's expression softened, and in that moment Inez saw the answer before Willa spoke. "Yes, but he's dying." The words hung in the air between them. "Cancer," Willa continued, "stage 4. He has maybe a few months left, maybe less. Where is he?" "A care facility in Bellingham. He's been there for 6 months." "Why didn't he contact me? Why wait until now?" "Because until now, it wasn't safe. The timber company, they never stopped looking for him. Not officially, but they had people. Private investigators, fixers. Dad spent 25 years being careful, staying hidden, moving when he had to. He couldn't risk leading them to you. But now, he's dying. And dying men stop being threats. The company doesn't care about him anymore. So he asked me to leave the box where you'd find it, to give you a choice." "What choice?" "Whether to come looking, whether you wanted to know the truth, or if you'd rather keep believing he was dead. He said it had to be your decision." Inez closed her eyes. 25 years. 25 years she'd lived believing a lie, and it turned out the lie was meant to protect her. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning." Willa nodded and began. "My mother died when I was born. Her name was Anne. She and Dad weren't married. They were young, barely 20. When she died, Dad raised me alone. He was still in school, working on his botany degree. We struggled, but we managed. Then he met you. I was about 3. He fell in love with you completely. He wanted to tell you about me, but he was afraid you'd leave if you knew he had a child, afraid of complicating things. So he kept me secret, hired babysitters when he was with you, kept our lives separate. When you got married, he almost told you. Almost. But by then the lie felt too big, and he convinced himself it was temporary, that he'd tell you soon, that he'd figure out how to bring us all together. But then the timber company happened. Dad discovered what they were doing, the illegal logging, the falsified reports. He went to the authorities because it was the right thing to do. He didn't realize how dangerous it was until they threatened him. They came to our house, 2 men. They told him if he testified, they'd make sure he regretted it. They mentioned you by name, said it would be easy to arrange an accident. Dad panicked. He went to the police, but there wasn't enough evidence to protect him. The trial was weeks away, and he knew that if he testified, they'd come after him, and they'd come after you. So he made a choice. He faked his death, made it look like a hiking accident. The timber company believed it, the police believed it, you believed it, and then he disappeared with me. We went to Crescent Bay because it was small and remote. He changed our names, kept us hidden. He homeschooled me. We lived quietly. We survived. Inez listened, tears streaming down her face. He did it to protect me. He did it to protect both of us. But especially you. He said he couldn't live with himself if something happened to you because of his choices. The box, the letters and photographs. Why did he keep them? Because he loved you. Because even though he couldn't be with you, he needed something of you close. He used to look at those photographs and tell me stories about how you met, about your wedding, about the life you'd planned together. He talked about me all the time. He taught me to draw plants using your techniques. He showed me your illustrations, the ones he'd kept. He said you were the best botanical artist he'd ever seen. Willa stood and went to a shelf, pulling down a leather-bound sketchbook. She handed it to Inez. Inside were botanical drawings, precise, detailed, beautiful. Alpine flowers, ferns, lichens. The style was familiar, echoing techniques Inez had developed years ago. He taught me, Willa said. Everything he knew, everything he learned from you. He wanted me to carry on that legacy. Inez traced her fingers over the drawings. These are beautiful. I tried to make him proud, to honor both of you. Does he know I'm looking for him? I called him yesterday, after the private investigator contacted the research station. I told him you might come, he cried. What did he say? That he hoped you would. That he wanted to see you one more time if you'd let him. Inez looked up at Willa. Will you take me to him? Yes. But Inez, you should know, he's not the man you remember. The cancer has taken a lot from him. He's weak, he's in pain, and he's carrying 25 years of guilt. I don't care what he looks like, I just need to see him. Willa nodded. We can leave tomorrow morning. It's about 2 hours from here. That night, Inez stayed in the research station's guest quarters. She lay awake, her mind churning with everything Willa had told her. Julian had protected her. He'd sacrificed everything, their marriage, their life together, his career to keep her safe, and she'd spent 25 years hating him for it. Not hating, exactly, but building walls against the memory of him, refusing to let herself grieve fully because grief had threatened to consume her. Now those walls were crumbling, and she didn't know what would be left when they fell. In the morning, Willa drove them to Bellingham in a battered truck, not unlike Inez's own. They didn't talk much. Willa seemed to understand that Inez needed silence, needed time to prepare herself. The care facility was small and quiet, a converted house on a residential street. Willa signed them in, and a nurse led them down a hallway to a room at the end. "He's having a good day," the nurse said, "alert and comfortable, but please don't stay too long. He tires easily." Willa squeezed Inez's hand. "I'll wait outside. Take as much time as you need." Inez stood alone in the hallway, staring at the closed door. Behind it was Julian, the man she'd loved, the man she'd lost, the man who'd lived an entire life she knew nothing about. She opened the door. The room was small and sunny, windows open to let in the spring air. There was a bed, a chair, a small table covered with books and papers, and in the bed, propped up on pillows, was Julian. He looked old. Not just older, old in the way that illness ages a person, hollowing them out from the inside. His hair was white and thin, his face was gaunt, the bones sharp beneath papery skin. But his eyes were the same, dark brown, intelligent, kind. Those eyes met hers, and he started to cry. "Inez," he whispered. She crossed the room in 3 steps and sat in the chair beside his bed. Up close, she could see how sick he was. The IV line in his arm, the oxygen tube in his nose, the way his hands trembled on the blanket. "I'm here," she said. "I didn't think you'd come. I hoped, but I didn't." His voice broke. She reached out and took his hand. It was cold and light, as if there was nothing left of him but bones and skin. But it was his hand, and she'd know it anywhere. "Willa told me everything," she said. "I'm sorry. God. Inez. I'm so sorry. Don't. Not yet. Let me just look at you." She studied his face, finding traces of the man she'd known beneath the ravages of illness, the scar on his temple from a childhood bicycle accident, the slightly crooked front tooth, the way his left eyebrow raised higher than his right when he was emotional. "You're really here?" he said wonderingly. "I thought I'd die without seeing you again." "You almost did. I wanted to contact you so many times. After the first year, after 5 years, after 10. I'd pick up the phone and dial your number. I still knew it by heart, but I'd hang up before it rang. I was so afraid they'd trace it, afraid I'd put you in danger. The timber company." He nodded weakly. "Pacific Northwest Lumber. They had connections everywhere, money, influence. I testified despite everything, but they found ways to discredit me, made it look like I'd falsified data. When I disappeared, it confirmed their narrative that I was unstable, unreliable. But I knew they'd keep looking. I'd seen what they did to other whistleblowers, people who ended up in accidents, people who suddenly lost their jobs, their reputations. I couldn't risk that happening to you. So you faked your death and took Willa to Crescent Bay. Yes, Jim Corley was my new identity. Everything documented, legitimate. Cost me most of the savings I'd hidden away, but it kept us safe. Why didn't you tell me about Willa before? Before any of this happened?" Julian closed his eyes. "Cowardice. Pure cowardice. I was young when Anne died. I didn't know how to handle being a single father. By the time I met you, Willa was 3, and I'd built this separate life. I told myself I'd tell you eventually. After we were married, after you'd settled in, after. And then it was too late. You'd fallen in love with someone who didn't exist, a man without complications, without a secret child. I was terrified that if you knew the truth, you'd leave. So I kept lying, and every lie made the next one easier. I would have understood. I know that now. But at 25, I didn't. I was an idiot. Despite everything, Inez felt a small smile tug at her lips. You were. I'm sorry I stole 25 years from us. You were protecting me. Willa explained. That doesn't make it hurt less. For either of us. They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped. Tell me about your life, Julian said. Willa said you've been living in the mountains. I built a cabin, the one we always talked about, just not together. Is it everything we imagined? It's quiet, peaceful, hard work, but satisfying. Do you draw? Inez shook her head. I stopped after you died. I couldn't make myself pick up a pen. Julian's eyes filled with tears again. Inez, no. You were so talented. It hurt too much. Everything reminded me of you, the plants we'd studied together, the techniques you'd encouraged me to try. It was easier to put it away. That's my fault. God, that's all my fault. Stop, she said firmly. We've both lost enough. I don't want to spend what time we have left assigning blame. What? The time we have left? He said it softly, acknowledging the reality. The doctors say weeks, maybe a month. Then we'll use them. No more wasted time. You'll stay? As long as you're here, I'll be here. Julian brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. I don't deserve you. Probably not, but you've got me anyway. Over the next 3 days, Inez stayed in Bellingham. Willa got her a room at a nearby hotel, but Inez spent most of her time at the care facility, sitting with Julian. They talked about everything, their early days together, their wedding, their dreams. Julian told her about Willa's childhood, the years in Crescent Bay, the small moments of joy he'd found despite the grief of losing Inez. She's a remarkable woman, Inez said. Your daughter. She is. She saved me, in a lot of ways. Gave me something to live for when I wanted to give up. She showed me her drawings. They're beautiful. She learned from the best. I taught her everything you taught me. Why? Plants? Why did you encourage that? Because it was the thing that connected all of us. You, me, Willa. Plants were what I studied, what you drew, what made sense of the world for all of us. I wanted her to have that legacy. On the 4th day, Julian seemed weaker. He slept more, spoke less. The nurse pulled Inez aside and told her gently that he was declining faster than they'd expected. It happens sometimes, she said. Once people get the closure they're looking for, they let go. Inez sat by his bed that afternoon, watching him sleep. His breathing was shallow and labored despite the oxygen. His skin had taken on a greyish tone. She thought about the box in the tree, the photograph, the journey that had brought her here. All the anger and confusion had burned away, leaving only love and regret. Love for the man he'd been, regret for the years they'd lost. Julian stirred and opened his eyes. Still here, he murmured. Still here. Good. I wanted to tell you something. What? There's a letter. I wrote it 6 months ago. Willa has it. It explains everything, the timeline, the decisions I made, the reasons. I wanted you to have it. To understand. I already understand. No, there's more. Things about why I disappeared when I did. Things I haven't told anyone, not even Willa. Inez leaned forward. What things? The timber company. They didn't just threaten me, they killed someone. Another botanist who was going to testify. Made it look like suicide. I found out 2 days before I disappeared. That's when I knew it wasn't just threats. They would actually do it. Inez felt cold. Julian, I should have gone to the police, should have pushed harder for protection, but I was terrified, and I made a choice that saved my life but destroyed our marriage. I've lived with that every day since. You did what you thought was right. I did what was expedient. There's a difference. He closed his eyes again, exhausted by the effort of speaking. Inez sat with him as the afternoon faded into evening. Willa came by with dinner, and the 3 of them sat together in the small room. It felt almost normal, almost like a family. That night, after Willa left and the facility grew quiet, Julian spoke again. Will you forgive me? Inez looked at him. This man she'd loved, who'd loved her, who'd made terrible choices for complicated reasons. Yes, she said. I forgive you. Do you mean it? I mean it. Julian smiled, and for a moment she saw the young man she'd married. Thank you. That's all I needed. He fell asleep holding her hand. Julian rallied the next day, experiencing what the nurses called a final surge of energy. He was alert, able to sit up, wanting to talk. Inez marveled at the change, even as she understood what it meant. This was the body's last gift, a chance to say goodbye. Willa arrived early, bringing coffee and pastries. The three of them sat together in Julian's room, the morning sun streaming through the windows. "I want to hear about the cabin," Julian said. "Every detail. Paint me a picture." So Inez told him. About choosing the site, felling the trees, notching the logs. About building the roof, installing the wood stove, carving the door frame. About the first winter, when she'd been certain she'd made a terrible mistake, and the spring that had followed, when everything had bloomed and she'd felt something close to peace. "You did it," Julian said wonderingly. "Everything we planned. You built it. I built it because of you. Because you taught me to love the wilderness. Because we dreamed about it together. I wish I could have seen it. I'll take photographs. Show you." But they both knew there wouldn't be time for that. Willa cleared her throat gently. "Dad, there's something I should give Inez. The letter you wrote." Julian nodded. "Yes, in my things. The wooden box on the shelf." Willa retrieved a small carved box from the corner of the room. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was an tissue paper envelope addressed to Inez in Julian's shaky handwriting. "Read it now," Julian said, "while I'm here to answer questions." Inez opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were several pages covered in Julian's cramped script. She began to read. The letter detailed everything, the timeline of events, the threats, the murder of the other botanist. But it also contained things Inez hadn't known. Julian had kept a journal of sorts, documenting every day he'd thought about her. 25 years of entries. Day 47. Saw a woman with red hair today, and my heart stopped. Day 823. It's Inez's birthday. She's 40 today. I wonder if she's happy. Day 4892. Willa asked me today why I never remarried. I told her the truth that I'm already married, in every way that matters. The letter also contained practical information. Julian had set up a bank account in Inez's name years ago, depositing money whenever he could. It wasn't much, maybe $30,000, but it was there, waiting for her. "I couldn't leave you with nothing," the letter explained. "I couldn't stand the thought of you struggling because of choices I made. I know you're too proud to use it, but please consider it a small repayment for everything I took from you." Inez looked up from the letter, tears streaming down her face. "Julian, you didn't have to." "I did. I owed you so much more. That's just a token. How did you get money?" "You were hiding. Odd jobs, cash work. Willa helped, once she was old enough. We lived simply." Willa nodded. "We learned to need very little, like you did, Inez. We survived," the letter continued, moving from practical matters to emotional ones. Julian wrote about his regrets, his hopes for Inez's future, his gratitude that Willa had grown into such a remarkable woman. The final paragraph made Inez's breath catch. "I know I'm asking the impossible, but I hope you'll let Willa into your life. She's the best part of me, the part that isn't broken or cowardly. She's strong where I was weak, brave where I was afraid. She needs a mother, Inez. She's always needed a mother. And you need family. You need someone to carry forward the work you started, the art you abandoned. Please don't let my mistakes rob you both of that connection. You're more alike than you know. You're both survivors. You're both stronger than I ever was. Take care of each other." Inez folded the letter carefully and looked at Willa. The younger woman's eyes were wet, but she met Inez's gaze steadily. "He's right," Willa said. "We are alike." "I'd like to know you," Inez said. "Really know you. Not just as Julian's daughter, but as yourself. I'd like that too." Julian was smiling, watching them. "That's all I wanted, to bring you two together. To fix one thing before I go. You've fixed more than one thing, Inez said. You've given me the truth, and that matters. They spent the rest of the day together, sharing stories. Willa told Inez about her work at the research station, the species she was studying, the reforestation projects she was part of. Inez found herself drawn into the conversation, asking technical questions, offering observations from her own years in the mountains. You should see the alpine meadows near the station, Willa said. The diversity is incredible. Hundreds of species in a single acre. I'd like to see that. Then come visit. Stay for a while. I have a guest room. I might do that. Julian listened to them talk, his eyes moving between them, a look of contentment on his face. This, he said quietly, this is what I wanted. As evening approached, he grew tired again. Inez and Willa helped him lie back down, arranged his pillows, made sure he was comfortable. Tell me something, Julian said to Inez. Something you've learned in the last 25 years, something that made you who you are now. Inez thought for a moment. I learned that solitude and loneliness aren't the same thing. I chose solitude. I built a life around it, but I was lonely, even if I didn't admit it. I thought being alone meant being safe, but really, it just meant being separate. And now I think maybe I'm ready to be less separate. Good, Julian said softly. That's good. He fell asleep again, his breathing shallow but steady. Inez and Willa sat on either side of him, keeping watch. How did you do it? Willa asked quietly. All those years alone. Didn't you go crazy? Sometimes I thought I would, but there was always work to do, always something that needed attention. The garden, the firewood, the cabin maintenance, it kept me grounded. Dad said you were an artist, that you drew plants. I was. I'm not sure I am anymore. Muscle memory doesn't forget. You could pick it up again. Maybe. I could use an illustrator, Willa said, for my research. The photographs don't capture the detail we need. I've been doing my own drawings, but they're not. She hesitated. They're not as good as yours. Would be. You've never seen my work. Yes, I have. Dad kept your drawings, the ones from the box and others. He showed them to me when I was learning. Said I should study your technique. Did it help? Yes, but I'd rather learn from you directly. Inez was quiet, considering. The thought of drawing again, of picking up a pen and rendering a plant in careful detail, was both terrifying and thrilling. I'll think about it, she said. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to Julian breathe. Outside, night fell, and the sounds of the care facility grew quiet. Nurses checked in periodically, but mostly they were alone. Around midnight, Julian woke briefly. He looked at Inez, then at Willa. My two favorite people, he murmured. Together. That's perfect. We're here, Dad, Willa said. Don't leave him, Julian said to Inez. When I'm gone. Don't leave Willa alone. I won't. Promise me. I promise. He smiled and closed his eyes again. Good. That's good. His breathing slowed, deepened. Inez held his hand, feeling his pulse flutter beneath her fingers. The nurse came in, checked his vitals, looked at them with sympathy. It won't be long now, she said gently. A few hours. Maybe. A day at most. Inez nodded. She'd known. Had felt it in the way Julian's skin had grown cooler, the way his grip had weakened. Willa leaned her head on Inez's shoulder, and Inez put her arm around her. They sat like that through the night, two women who barely knew each other, bound together by love for the same man. At dawn, as the first light touched the window, Julian took a deep breath and let it out slowly. And then he was gone. The silence in the room was absolute. Inez sat holding Julian's hand, feeling the warmth slowly leave his skin. Beside her, Willa wept quietly, her face pressed against Inez's shoulder. The nurse came in, confirmed what they already knew, and left them alone to say their goodbyes. I thought I'd said goodbye to him 25 years ago. Inez said softly. I thought I'd already grieved. But this is different. This is real. Willa said yes. They sat for a long time, neither wanting to be the first to leave. Eventually, Willa stood and kissed her father's forehead. Goodbye, Dad. Thank you for everything. Inez stood too. She looked down at Julian's face, peaceful now, free of pain. She thought about the young man she'd married, the life they'd planned, the years they'd lost. Thank you for protecting me, she whispered. And thank you for Willa. She kissed him gently and turned away. The next few days passed in a blur of arrangements. Julian had left instructions he wanted to be cremated, his ashes scattered in the mountains. No service, no fuss, just the two of them, returning him to the wild places he'd loved. Willa handled the paperwork with quiet efficiency. Inez helped where she could, but mostly she was there for support, a steady presence, while Willa navigated the logistics of death. They stayed together at Willa's house, a small place near the research station. It was simple and functional, much like Inez's cabin. Books everywhere, plant specimens drying on every surface, a sense of useful clutter. You live like I do, Inez observed. I learned from the best, Willa said with a small smile. They talked late into the nights, filling in gaps in each other's stories. Willa told Inez about growing up with Julian, the constant moving to stay ahead of perceived threats, the isolation, and the freedom of their unconventional life. He taught me everything, Willa said. How to identify plants, how to move quietly in the woods, how to be self-sufficient, but he also taught me about you. He made sure I knew there was this remarkable woman out there who'd loved him, who he'd loved. He didn't want me to think he'd chosen our life over being with someone he loved. He wanted me to understand he'd chosen it to keep you safe. Did you resent me? Inez asked. Willa considered the question. Sometimes, when I was a teenager, I thought it was unfair that I had to hide because of threats to someone I'd never met. But as I got older, I understood. Dad made the best choice he could in an impossible situation. And he made sure I knew about you not as a ghost, but as a real person he still loved. He showed you my drawings, every one he had. He told me about your process, your technique. He said you could spend hours on a single leaf, getting every vein exactly right. He said watching you work was like watching someone pray. Inez felt tears prick her eyes. I'd forgotten that about myself. Maybe you could remember. On the third day after Julian's death, they drove into the mountains to scatter his ashes. Willa had chosen a place near the research station, a high meadow filled with wildflowers, surrounded by old-growth forest. They hiked in together, carrying Julian's ashes in a simple wooden box. The day was clear and warm, the kind of day Julian had always loved. At the meadow, they sat for a while, not speaking. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of pine and flowers. He would have liked this place, Inez said. He did. We came here often. He said it reminded him of where you lived. The Cascades are different, but yes, the feeling is the same. Willa opened the box and stood. Inez joined her. Together they walked through the meadow, scattering Julian's ashes among the flowers. The wind caught them, carrying them up and away, into the forest and the sky beyond. When the box was empty, they stood holding hands, watching the ashes settle. He's free now, Willa said. Yes, finally, free. They hiked back down as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. At the car, Willa hesitated. What will you do now? She asked. Go back to your cabin? Inez had been thinking about that question since Julian died. The cabin was still there, waiting for her, but it felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a self-imposed prison. I don't know, she said honestly. Part of me wants to go back. It's my home. But part of me thinks maybe it's time for something different. You could stay here for a while, help me with my research. There's plenty of room. I couldn't impose. It's not imposing. Dad wanted us to know each other, to be family. I'd like that, if you would. Inez looked at this woman who was a stranger and yet somehow familiar. Julian's daughter, someone who understood plants and mountains and solitude, someone who carried half of Julian's DNA and all of his passion for the natural world. "I'd like that too," Inez said. Inez stayed. Not permanently, not yet, but for weeks that stretched into months. She found a rhythm at the research station, helping Willa with her work during the day, cooking together in the evenings, talking long into the night. It was strange at first, being around another person after so many years of solitude. The small sounds of someone else in the house, footsteps, running water, the soft murmur of Willa on the phone with colleagues. But gradually, Inez found it comforting rather than intrusive. Willa was easy to be around. She understood silence, didn't fill every moment with chatter. They could work side by side for hours, without speaking, communicating in the shorthand of people who understood the same things. One morning, about 6 weeks after Julian's death, Willa set a sketchbook and a set of pens on the kitchen table. "What's this?" Inez asked. "A plant I've been studying. Alpine forget-me-not. It's endangered, and we're trying to establish a seed bank, but I need detailed illustrations for the documentation. My drawings aren't good enough." "Willa, just try. Please, for the plant if not for me." Inez looked at the small potted specimen on the table. Myosotis alpestris, delicate blue flowers, hairy leaves, a hardy little thing clinging to life in harsh conditions. She hadn't drawn in 25 years. Her hands were rougher now, scarred and calloused, but Willa was right about muscle memory. When she picked up the pen, her fingers knew what to do. She started with the overall structure, sketching lightly. Then the details, the 5-petaled flowers, the arrangement of the leaves, the texture of the stems. She lost herself in the work, the way she used to, the world narrowing to just the plant and the paper. 2 hours later, she set down the pen. The drawing was good, not as refined as her old work. Her hand was rustier than she'd thought, but it was recognizable as hers. The same attention to detail, the same balance of scientific accuracy and artistic grace. Willa had been watching from across the room. She came over now and looked at the drawing. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It's exactly what I needed. It's rough. I'm out of practice. Practice is just time. You've still got the gift." Inez looked at the tints, drawing, feeling something unfamiliar. Not quite joy, but something close. Satisfaction, maybe. Or purpose. "Could you do more?" Willa asked. "For the project? I could pay you. I don't need payment. But yes, I could do more." Over the next weeks, Inez drew. Alpine flowers, mostly, the species Willa was studying. Each drawing came easier than the last, her hand remembering skills she'd thought were lost. Willa was working on a paper about climate change impacts on alpine ecosystems, and she wanted to include Inez's illustrations. She asked permission first, carefully. It would list you as the illustrator. Your name would be on the publication. Inez hadn't thought about having her name on anything in years. "Use whatever name you need. I'll use Inez Corley, if that's all right. That's who I am." The paper was submitted in August. By September, it had been accepted. Willa showed Inez the acceptance letter, beaming. "They loved your illustrations. The reviewers specifically mentioned them." "That's good. It's better than good. It means your work is being seen again. It means you're contributing to science again." Inez hadn't thought about it in those terms. She'd just been drawing plants because Willa needed help. But Willa was right. It was more than that. It was a return to something she'd loved and lost. One evening in late September, as they were preparing dinner, Willa asked the question Inez had been expecting. "Will you go back to your cabin before winter?" "I should. I need to prepare it, make sure everything's secure." "But will you come back here?" Inez looked at Willa, this woman who'd become family over the course of a summer. "Would you want me to?" "Yes, very much. This place is too big for one person, and the work is too much for me alone." Besides, Willa hesitated, I like having you here. It feels right. It does, doesn't it? So you'll come back? Let me go prepare the cabin, make sure it's properly winterized. Then yes, I'll come back. Maybe not permanently, but regularly. That's enough. Inez left for her cabin in early October, driving the familiar road back to the mountains. The cabin was as she'd left it, dusty but intact. She spent a week cleaning, repairing, winterizing. She split wood, checked the roof, stored supplies. But something had changed. The cabin felt smaller now, lonelier. It was still her sanctuary, but it was no longer her prison. On her last night, she built a fire and sat looking at the place she'd called home for 25 years. So much had happened here. So much grief had been processed within these walls. So much solitude had been chosen and embraced. But there were other ways to live, other kinds of sanctuary. In the morning, she locked the cabin door and drove back to Willa. Back to the research station, to the work, to the family she'd found in the most unexpected way. She wasn't leaving the cabin forever. She'd come back, she knew, for visits, for solitude when she needed it, for connection to the life she'd built. But she wasn't living alone anymore. She was living. Winter at the research station was different from winter at the cabin, less harsh, more accessible. Snow fell, but it melted between storms. The work continued, though at a slower pace. Inez and Willa settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings were for research, Willa in the lab, Inez at her drawing table. Afternoons were flexible, sometimes fieldwork, sometimes maintenance, sometimes just reading by the fire. Evenings were for cooking and conversation. They talked about Julian often, not with grief, but with affection, remembering his quirks, his passions, his flaws. The conversations helped both of them process not just his death, but his life. The complicated, messy, beautiful life he'd lived. He'd be happy we found each other, Willa said one evening. He orchestrated it. The box in the tree, the trail of breadcrumbs. He wanted this. Do you think he knew that he was bringing us together? I think he hoped, and hope was enough. In December, a package arrived for Inez. Inside was a letter from Louise Brennan, the private investigator in Crescent Bay, along with a newspaper clipping. The clipping was an obituary. Julian Corley, age 64, died peacefully in Bellingham. It listed his accomplishments as a botanist, his work on environmental conservation, his dedication to alpine ecology. It mentioned Willa as his surviving daughter, and it mentioned Inez as his wife. Willa must have written this, Inez said, showing her the clipping. I did. I wanted people to know the truth. Or as much of the truth as could be told. You were his wife. You should be acknowledged as such. Inez read the obituary again, seeing her name in print next to Julian's. It felt right. A public recognition of what had always been true, that they'd loved each other, that their bond had survived separation and secrecy and time. Louise's letter was brief. Thought you'd want to see this. The obituary ran in papers up and down the coast. Several of Julian's old colleagues reached out to me asking for more information. I told them what I could. His legacy is being remembered now, and so is his courage. That matters. It did matter. Julian had sacrificed his career, his reputation, his life to do the right thing. And now, finally, that sacrifice was being recognized. In January, Inez received an unexpected phone call. The University of Washington wanted to mount an exhibition of botanical illustrations, and they'd heard she had significant work. Would she be interested in contributing? Inez's first instinct was to refuse. But Willa encouraged her. Your work should be seen. It's too good to keep hidden. I haven't drawn professionally in decades, but you're drawing now. Beautiful, publishable work. Let people see it. So Inez agreed. She sent them 20 illustrations old work from before Julian's, disappearance, and new work from her months at the research station. The curator was delighted, calling them exquisite and scientifically significant. The exhibition would open in April. As spring approached, Inez found herself thinking about the future for the first time in years. Not just the immediate future, but years ahead. What did she want? What would bring her satisfaction and purpose? The answer surprised her with its simplicity. She wanted to draw plants, work with Willa, and maintain connections with the world beyond the mountains. Not a grand ambition, not a dramatic change. Just a life with balance, solitude and community, work and rest, memory and hope. In March, she and Willa drove to Seattle for a meeting with the university about the exhibition. It was Inez's first time in the city in 25 years. The changes were overwhelming: new buildings, new highways, technology she barely understood. But the university campus was familiar. The trees, she remembered, were older but recognizable. The Burke Museum, where her work would be displayed, felt like coming home. The curator showed them the exhibition space, explaining how they'd mount the illustrations, what text would accompany them. Willa stood beside Inez, beaming with pride. "Your mother would have loved this," the curator said to Willa, assuming they were mother and daughter. Willa didn't correct her. Neither did Inez. The exhibition opened on a rainy April afternoon. More people attended than Inez had expected. Former colleagues, students, botanists from across the region. They praised her work, asked about her process, wanted to know where she'd been. She told them a simplified version of the truth. She'd been living in the mountains, taking a break from public work. Now she was back, collaborating with her stepdaughter on alpine ecology research. No one needed to know the full story. Some truths were meant to be private. Among the attendees was an elderly man who introduced himself as Gerald Price, a former colleague of Julian's from the timber scandal days. "I always wondered what happened to you," he said. "After Julian died, you disappeared. I tried to reach out but couldn't find you. I needed time alone. I understand. What Julian did, testifying against Pacific Northwest Lumber, it was incredibly brave. We all knew it was dangerous. When he died, we suspected it wasn't really an accident. But there was no proof, and the company was powerful. I'm sorry we couldn't do more. He did what he thought was right. He did, and it cost him everything. But his testimony, even though the case fell apart, it started something. Other people came forward. Eventually, the company was investigated and fined. They're still in business, but they're more careful now." Julian's courage mattered. Inez felt tears in her eyes. "Thank you for telling me that." After the reception, Inez and Willa walked through the campus, past the buildings where Inez had once studied, where Julian had once worked. "How does it feel?" Willa asked. "Being back here? Strange, like visiting a past life. But good, too. Closure, maybe. Do you think you'll do more exhibitions? More public work?" "I don't know. I like the quiet work better, drawing for research, for documentation. Work that serves a purpose beyond just being seen. Then that's what you'll do." They drove back to the research station as the sun was setting. The mountains rose ahead of them, still snow-capped, beautiful and indifferent. Inez thought about the journey that had brought her here, from grief to isolation to unexpected connection, from believing Julian was dead to learning he'd lived, loved, and protected her from afar, from solitude to family. It wasn't the life she'd planned, it wasn't the life she'd thought she wanted, but it was a good life. A life with meaning and purpose and love. At the research station, Willa made tea while Inez built up the fire. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the flames. "I'm glad you found me," Willa said eventually. "I'm glad you left the box where I'd find it. Dad was right. We needed each other. Yes, we did." Outside, the spring evening faded into night. Inside, the fire burned warm, and two women who'd been strangers sat as family, bound together by loss and love and the patient work of healing. Inez picked up her sketchbook and began to draw. A forget-me-not, rendered in careful detail, each petal, each leaf, each tiny hair on the stem. The work of a lifetime, resumed, the work of remembering and honoring and moving forward, the work of living,